Effectively communicating analysis results. My name is Tim Wilson. I'm the Vice President of Measurement Analytics at Clearhead, which is an Austin-based digital optimization agency. So my very quick personal logo slide. I've been in the digital analytics space for a number of years. The best way to kind of measure that is that my first web analytics platform that I worked with was NetGenesis, which is long since defunct. I think the other thing that my history shows is that I have a very strong affinity for companies whose logos fall somewhere on the blue-green color spectrum. And I'm currently at a nice cyan-themed company called Clearhead, which is based here in Austin. It's a digital optimization agency. But diving into the topic of my presentation here, effectively communicating analysis results. It's one of those things that we've all been there, right? We have done an analysis where we are running the good race. We've done a lot of hard work. We've pulled the data. We've got it cleansed. We've got it integrated. We've done a regression. We've got ANOVA tables. We've done a great analysis, and we're ready to charge across the figurative finish line, deliver actionable insights to our company, and help them move forward as a company. And instead, this is what happens. Somewhere along the way, something goes wrong. We look back a week after we've delivered the results, or a month or 2 months, and say, what happened? Like, no action was ever taken, or the wrong action was taken. What happened? Well, why does this happen? My claim is that it's because as analysts, we really want the data to just speak for itself. But the fact is the analysis itself is absolutely part of what it's a key part of having a company be data-driven. But the fact is there's a bunch of other stuff that has to be done as well. If it's not there, then the analysis has a very high risk of going nowhere. Another way to put it, and I realize I just said to a room full of analysts, I guess, that the analysis itself is not the be-all, end-all. So that's a shock. But the fact is, as analysts, we are most comfortable flexing our analytical muscle, right? It's understandable. It makes sense. But there are other muscles that we need to be exercising. It's not comfortable, it's not natural, but there are complementary things we have to do in conjunction with the analysis if we really want our analysis to drive action and drive the right action. One way to think about that is that the analysis is at the core, but we have to do the right stuff before the analysis, and we have to do the right stuff after an analysis and do it really well in order for kind of the whole product of analytics to be effective. So if we look at the world of analysis and kind of step back a little bit and say, yeah, there's great analysis in the middle, but we have to get the right business questions, make sure we're doing the right analysis in order to make this successful. And after we've actually done the analysis, there's this final step of actually communicating the results out. So ultimately, I'm talking about effectively communicating results out that drive action. We really have to look at what happens before, because that's foundational as well. So we kind of dive in. Let me talk about how do we get to synthesizing and getting to the right business questions. Well, I claim that it starts with us doing something that we're not analysts. It's not an analyst as an analyst. We have to be an analyst acting as a translator. Ultimately, we have to start with really clear goals. Okay, no duh. Telling an analyst that you have to have clear goals, and from clear goals come the right KPIs. We all know that. But at the same time, we say it's easy to say that you have to have good, strong KPIs. But the reality is the world's really messy. If I have a pure play e-commerce website and my KPIs are average order value, total revenue, and conversion rate, great, I've got strong KPIs. But that's only a fraction of what we're actually working with, right? What about when we work with the CPG brand where they're selling cat food and they're trying to figure out what the KPIs are for their Facebook page? Or they're selling frozen dinners and they're trying to figure out what the KPIs for their website are. So it is not easy. I will claim that the reason we struggle, and what I'll hear is what I've certainly run into is I know I need to have KPIs, but the marketer I'm working with isn't giving me good KPIs, so I just have to move without them. Well, really, I think what is happening is if we look back at the far side, remember Gary Larson, The far side, which actually I looked up during this presentation, his last strip was in 1995. So it was a long time ago, but this is one of his classic strips in my mind, where he says, "This is what a human is saying to a dog. You know, stay out of the garbage. Do you understand, Ginger? And what does Ginger the dog actually hear? Blah 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 blah. Ginger." Well, when we go to marketers and say, "What are your KPIs?" all too often, what they're hearing is, "I, the analyst, am not going to go away. I'm not going to leave you alone until you spout out some metrics that I can use." And I will claim that we need to not ask them for what are their KPIs. We need to step out of our comfort zone and not talk about the data. We need to step and help them get clarity and focus around their goals, and then help them get to appropriate KPIs. So marketers, they have goals. They know why they're doing a Facebook page. They know why they're rolling out a mobile app. They know what they're trying to get with this campaign. But sometimes those goals are a little bit unfocused. And we want to bring those goals into focus. We want to help them get clarity and concision. That certainly helps us be effective, but it also helps them. It helps everybody working on the project if they're really clear on what goals they need to drive. What we have is a nice strength as analysts, because we've got that. What we're ultimately trying to get to is hard, tangible measures. We have a great kind of filter we're applying that will help us really guide and decide and determine in a way, are these really clear goals? So how do we do that? How do we do that if we ask them for their KPIs and we don't get good results, good responses? What I'd argue that we can do is we can use what I call the magic questions, the two magic questions. And I totally stole these from a guy named Matt Cohen, who actually worked at a number of companies with red logos. He worked at Omniture, and then he worked at 4C, then he was client side. I worked with him in an agency at Resource Interactive for about a little year and change. And he and I did a lot of internal training. And he liked to say, and he kind of repeat it every time we were doing training, he would say, getting to appropriate KPIs is simple, but it's not easy. He said, all we got to do is ask two questions and get them answered well. I dubbed them, I said, those are like magical questions. They're not rocket science, but it's a great way to have a good conversation with our marketer. The first question is, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? And I'm not asking for, you marketer, I'm not asking for you to tell me what measures you want to hit. I'm asking for you to describe to me in plain English, as clearly as possible, what is it we're trying to do? Why do we have this Twitter account? Why are we going to do promoted tweets? Why do we have our website? We can be active listeners. We want to probe. We really are trying to understand as clearly as possible what we're trying to achieve and why it matters. So we can step out of our role and say, we're not doing anything with the data. We're just trying to get some real clarity around in layman's terms, in business terms, in clear language, what are we trying to do? Once we have that, we can ask the second question, well, how are we going to know if we did that? Which obviously, those are our KPIs. Those are our success measures. And what I've found in my career is that when I ask that second question, I get kind of one of three responses. Occasionally, and it's rare, I will get told, these are our measures of success. These are the targets we want to hit. But much more often, I get one of two things. I either get just metrics that are convenient and clearly understood. It's what are you trying to, how are we going to know if we've achieved success with our Facebook page? I'm going to count total fans or total likes, because those are readily available, easily understood what they mean, but they don't necessarily tie back to the goals. So that's sometimes we'll get what are the metrics I know, which aren't necessarily the right metrics, or we'll get, hey, you're the analyst, you tell me what the KPIs are. And we shouldn't step back and say, no, I want you to have your skin in the game. You need to tell me what you consider success. As analysts, we need to say, we'll take that. We will really help you answer that second question. We do know the data. We know the data better than anyone else. We know the caveats. We know how to get it. We know where the pitfalls are with it. If we've really understood clearly what the goals are, we can really be an active partner in determining what are the right KPIs, and even what targets. We can help do the research to say what are the appropriate targets for those KPIs, and we can get some real clarity. So in that case, there's nothing to do with analysis here other than we're laying a great foundation. We're helping translate from what are often unfocused business goals to very clear and concise goals, clearly articulated, and then translating from those into the right and appropriate KPIs and targets. So great. So we're ready to do analysis? Well, of course not, because having the goal, it's like getting told, hey, here's your login to Site Catalyst, and the goal for our site is to drive revenue. Log in and go find me something. Go find me changes I can make that will improve my KPIs. Well, there's a leap there. What we really need are hypotheses. We have to have a hypothesis to test, which is the analyst wearing another hat. The analyst is a cartographer, a map maker. Ultimately, to do a great analysis, we have to have a really crystallized hypothesis. But if we think about it, if we go back to our Far Side cartoon, what happens to a marketer when we say, what's your hypothesis? Well, what do they hear? They hear, I'm going to drag you back to 8th grade science class that you really didn't enjoy. You got into marketing. You didn't get into chemistry with your career. So we can't really do that. Ultimately, we need to get to a great hypothesis, but we should be, again, speaking in a marketer's terms. What question are you trying to answer? What problem are you trying to solve? What idea do you have for improving the channel or the campaign or the promotion? And then we can do a mapping exercise. We can say, we got a plain English business idea or question. First, I'm going to map that to the goals and KPIs that we've established. Can I understand? Can I articulate? It may be obvious, but it may be a more second level logical link that I have to map out. How does answering this question actually relate to driving and improving and delivering on one or more of these KPIs? And if it doesn't, then we need to kind of sit down and ask the question, why are we asking that question? So generally, it's not that the questions are bad. In a lot of cases, we're just not fully understanding what the marketer is really trying to get at. So doing that mapping exercise adds value. We can feed that back to the marketer and say, so the reason we're trying to solve this problem or answer this question is because that will help us improve this KPI, right? Make sure I, the analyst, have my eye on the prize. The second mapping piece that I'm doing from that question is translating it into a testable hypothesis. So what we find is we'll get a question, and the reality is it's 2 or 3 kind of hypotheses are embedded in it. And we can put the rigor into that exercise as analysts and say, I'm going to take your question and I'm going to turn it into something that I know I could actually test and I could disprove or fail to disprove. And again, I can play that back to you, the marketer, and say, this is what I'm going to try to prove. And if I prove that, does that move you forward? So that's the mapping exercise. And one way to do that, and this is, I can say I didn't have the phrase hypothesis catalog. That's a Clearhead thing that we use. 7 syllables, 2 words, powerful marketing. But the idea is pretty simple, and I have used that for a number of years, which is I want to start with those business questions. I want to capture them, I want to log them, and I want to do that mapping exercise. So this can be an Excel spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet, a Lotus Notes database, a third-party platform. We actually use User Voice for some of this, where we take the question and we do that mapping. We say, as an analyst, I will sit down and make sure that I am clear on what KPIs that question relates to. I will then translate that question into a testable hypothesis. As an analyst, we can kind of own that. We can record that. We can log it. And that will set us up for having the right question that we're trying to analyze. But really just capturing the question and translating to hypotheses isn't really enough either, is it? Because really, we have to play a role as a process manager because we want to have a lot of questions. We want to have more questions than we could possibly answer. We want supply or demand to exceed supply. Certainly that'll keep us employed, but the real reason is because if we have 100 questions we're trying to answer and we can only answer 3, it's going to force us, hopefully if we have a good process, to answer the 3 that are going to be the most impactful. And that's good. If we only had 3 questions, they could be stinkers. If we said as soon as we hit our capacity to answer questions, we're going to stop asking questions, then we're going to ask a lot of questions that are pretty low value to answer. So we want to have more questions. We want to ask as many people as possible, really. If we organizationally, what do we want? If I've got a website, if my partner has a website, I hope that they're encouraging their call center and the CSRs to be able to provide feedback and say we have a problem and log it and ask those questions. But if we have all these questions coming in, then I guess we have to prioritize them, which requires process. And by the way, that's not a once a year thing or even a once a quarter thing. We need to be prioritizing those questions regularly in some sort of ongoing, low latency, high frequency process. Well, how do we do that? Well, we have to have a process. So the analyst, again, not doing analysis, figuring out the process for analytics at the organization or the department or whatever kind of the scope of responsibility, the analyst can really develop and own that. We shouldn't be relying on our partners to figure out a process to make sure we're getting the right work and managing it in the right time frame and being effective with it. One way to, and that process is going to vary from organization to organization. It depends on culture, depends on the nature of the business, depends on the size and scope and organization of the analytics team. But having a process that really works and refining it and then owning it is critical. Now, I'll say one way to approach that is to expand that hypothesis catalog. Let's add more columns. Let's look at, for each of those testable hypotheses we had, what's the expected impact, what's the expected effort, just kind of quickly assessed. How are we actually going to test that hypothesis? Are we going to test it with an A/B test or a multivariate test? Are we going to do some analysis of historical web analytics data? Are we going to dig into our voice of the customer system? Are we actually going to realize to test this hypothesis, really some primary research? A focus group is really probably the best way to answer this, because even though that may not be our core department, we understand where focus groups sit and where usability studies sit. And we're going to figure out what the best approach to test that hypothesis is. So on the one hand, assessing the impact and the effort, I mean, that's any A/B testing process 101, right? You come up with all your test ideas, you assess kind of how much lift you think the test might give you, and you assess the effort, and then you go after the high impact, low effort tests. Yeah, that's 1 in 20 ideas that come up. The fact is, it's a lot messier. And that's why we need a process, and it's why we need to be willing to step up and say, this is hard. When we have 20 hypotheses we could test, we have to sit down and think through, what are the first 3 that we should do? Which ones make the most sense based on all of the constraints that we're dealing with? So that's all getting to the right business question. And once we've got the right business question, we actually have to do a great analysis. Now, this is good. We know we're doing an analysis that's more likely to be high value, because we've helped really put some rigor in without doing actually anything with data and analytics yet. We've really positioned ourselves to do a great analysis. So then it's the analyst as analyst. And I'm not going to talk about that at all. That's where the magic happens. That's where we wave our magic wand, or it's actually where we roll up our sleeves and dig into really messy, non-deterministic data and do the best we can with the messy world of human beings' behavior and the analysis of them. But we do great analysis. So we've got that done. Well, now we actually we're not finished. We have to step back out of our comfort zone and make sure we really effectively communicate the results. So obviously that means the analyst is a communicator. Not necessarily something that is a rule we shine at. That is our forte, communication. But we've got to figure out how to do it better. We've got to get good at it. We've got to practice. We've got to learn and hone those skills and build those muscles. Because the data does not speak for itself, which we want to believe that it does. We say it speaks to us, but does it speak to our partners? Another thing I actually have had some people say, function follows form, meaning the data, as long as I've got the data there, it really doesn't matter how it's presented, because the data is really the answer. And that's just not true. The fact is we need people to consume the takeaways and the information that the data represents, that the analysis is told, and we need to be effective at doing that. So if you think about it, you're the expert on the data. You spent the last 2 weeks doing an analysis. You've dug in, you know what conclusions to draw, you know the problem you were trying to solve, you know the roadblocks you ran into along the way. And so you have a natural bias because it's not you that you're speaking to. So we all have to actually recognize when we're presenting results, we have to really divorce ourselves away from what would be most effective if we were presenting to ourselves. And that's hard. It is hard to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, but we have to because we're presenting to somebody else. And the fact is, if we're presenting to 5 people or 10 or 20, it's really not that we're communicating to all of them. We're communicating to 1 or 2, the 1 or 2 people who are actually empowered and have the responsibility and the ability to act on the results of our analysis. So before we do anything with putting a single slide together or making a single chart for presenting our results, we have to answer the question, who, very specifically who, needs to do what? What action does that person need to take? Who am I really speaking to? And everything I'm putting together needs to be speaking to that person. It doesn't really matter if the CMO is in the room. Well, it does matter if the CMO is in the room. But if the CMO is not the one who's actually going to take the action, worry more about the person who will take the action. And then make sure you're not going to offend the CMO and that they'll be happy and get whatever they're expecting as well. We've got to lead with who needs to do what. And it can be hard to figure out what is the recommended action. But all too often, what I feel like we do is we will do an analysis, we will find something, we will have an insight and say, aha, we found something that we did not know. We have something we've learned. I will take it and present it, and then I will trust the room to chew on how they're actually going to act, what they're going to do about that. And that's not good. As analysts, we need to say, let's go all the way to putting a stake in the ground and say, based on this analysis, I believe this is the action we need to take. We start with that. We have that locked into our mind. And then when we put the presentation together, we absolutely lead with one thing. This is the business problem that my results are going to help us address. I'm going to state that as clearly, as succinctly. I will use metaphor. I will pour over the language. I will make sure that it is clear and it is concise. And this is the business problem that the person who will be taking that action cares about. So I'm speaking to the person who, when I lay out that business problem, will sit up and say, that is something that has been keeping me up at night. And if this person can help me mitigate that problem, I'm paying attention. And then the next thing we do is we give the answer. So we have this tendency that we think that I've stated the problem. Now let me treat this like a 3-act play. Let me walk through all the stuff that I did to get to the answer, and then I'll have the big reveal. The climax coming in Act 3 will be, here's the answer. I'm going to build up suspense. And then I'll get polite applause and we'll kick around some next steps, which will be the denouement, and the meeting will end. Don't do that. This isn't a 3-act play. This is presenting the results of an analysis. Start with a problem, back it up with the answer and the specific action that needs to be taken. But are we done? Well, no. Even though they may trust us and like us and know we do a good job, they're still going to want to understand, okay, how did you get to that answer? I need to understand why, because I'm going to have to justify and articulate and know and have confidence that I'm taking this action for a reason, and I understand why. But at that point, we have to be really careful to not start showing all of our work. We have this tendency to get back to where we think, well, what would convince me as an analyst that this was the right answer? Well, if you took that 2 weeks of analysis you did and compress it down in to 40 minutes and walk me through it kind of step by step, what data you got, where you got the data, how you cleansed it, how you joined it together, what pitfalls you ran into, how you overcame those, we have this tendency to think as analysts, that is so cool that if we do that, that will build credibility. That will be the way that the person we're speaking to will be sitting back and just enthralled and enraptured. And they'll think, man, I wish I had been looking over your shoulder for the last 2 weeks. That is so awesome. I am ready. I'm motivated. I am going to go take action. But don't show your work. Don't show that much work, because the reality is that will instead put your audience to sleep. Or the business equivalent, which is pulling up a phone, a tablet, or a laptop to check email. We don't want to do that. We have to concisely and clearly communicate the most critical data findings that support that answer. We have to do it in a way that's compelling, that's visually going to get them so that they will understand it. So maybe that's actually the analyst as an artist, right? We have all these tools of data visualization that are coming out willy-nilly. It's a hot topic. We take something like, we talk about cross references in the Bible, and we think a big table that shows those is going to be totally uninspiring. But wow, if I represent the Bible and these bars across the bottom and I link them uh, with lines, now I've got something that people will want to look at, something that's beautiful. So maybe we need to become artists, right? Remember Bob Ross, another guy from a while back, PBS. So we need to learn to be artists. Right about now, you're probably maybe freaking out because analysts, one thing, we're not don't tend to be great communicators. We certainly don't tend to be great artistic designers. The good news is no, we don't need to be artists. What the guy who did this specific visualization, a guy named Chris Harrison, when he described it, he said, I was aiming for something that was more beautiful than functional. He was not looking to impart insights. This is a totally valid type of data visualization for the purposes of putting a lot of data in and rendering something that is aesthetically interesting or engaging, but that's not what we're trying to do. We're actually trying to communicate information. This isn't the analyst as an artist. This is the analyst as a neuroscientist. Understanding how do we get the right information into the brains of the people who need to take action. Because if you think about it, we know somebody needs to take an action. Well, that means they're going to have to decide to take an action. In order for them to decide to take an action, they have to have the information in their brain that will get them to that decision to do that. So it behooves us to understand, how do we do that? How do we do that effectively? And the fact is, this is teachable. One of the coolest books that I stumbled across and read was a guy by the name, it's called Brain Rules, by a guy named James Medina. And one point he makes very, very early, he is a neuroscientist. The book is not a deep scientific, it's a very, very readable book. But he makes the point. He said there's a ton of stuff we do not understand about how the brain works. And we will not understand for the next 50 or 100 years at the earliest. It's a mystery. It's wonderful. It's magical. But there's absolutely some things that we do understand about how the brain works. These are Brain Rules, the name of his book. These we understand, and we should be leveraging what we understand to be more effective. So my quick one little kind of lesson there, and this actually James Medina talks to it in his book. This is also Stephen Few in his book, Information Dashboard Design, touches on these. Says we understand how stuff gets into long-term memory. When I put this slide up, you instantaneously took in the colors, the shapes, you even took in the words. You saw the words. That's happening all in iconic memory. It happens very fast. You're taking in stuff all around you. It's called the visual sensory register. It's where this fancy thing, pre-attentive cognitive processing occurs. Not much stuff makes it out of iconic memory as a percentage into short-term memory. But short-term memory is where we actually start doing a little bit of processing. That's our RAM. And short-term memory is what decides is going to shove down into long-term memory. Here's the real bitch about short-term memory. We can only hold 3 to 9 pieces of visual information simultaneously in short-term memory. So ultimately, we have a pretty tight choke point going through to get into long-term memory. And long-term memory includes the stuff that you're going to remember an hour from now, as well as tomorrow, as well as next week, as well as a month from now. So there are lots of things going on that reinforce what's getting into long-term memory. But when we're presenting analysis results, we have to get stuff into long-term memory if there's any hope of action being taken after we've presented the information. So in a sense, we're talking about optimizing the memory funnel. We want to remove as much friction as possible. That means we want to actually remove the opportunities for the brain to get distracted and not take the information that's the most critical and push it into long-term memory. And there are ways to do that. One of the most powerful, and I can point all the way back to when I worked at National Instruments years ago. It was where I was introduced to this concept in a book, in Stephen Few's book, Information Dashboard Design. It's the concept of maximizing the data pixel ratio, which Stephen Few got from Edward Tufte, who coined the term the data ink ratio. The idea is very simple. It's if you have a canvas, a dashboard, a report, a screen, and it's blank, Every pixel that you light up in the non-background color is doing one of two things. It is either conveying data and information, or it is purely structural or decorative. So what you want is to have as much of those pixels communicating information as absolutely possible. So you're never going to calculate the actual ratio, and you're never going to get to a ratio of 1. It's the idea, though, that you want to remove clutter. You want to have as much information presented being the actual information, not decorative and not structural. So really not a week goes by that I don't consciously actually apply this principle. It's kind of a blast, and it gets easier and easier as you do it, and it doesn't make for boring stuff. It makes for much more interpretable, understandable presentation of data. So let's take a very simple example. The typical Excel generated table of data. And some analyst has said, I don't want this to look like I just copied and pasted out of Excel with some gray lines around it. I'm gonna kind of dress it up. I'm gonna invert the heading so it stands out. I'm gonna put a heavy border around the outside. I'm gonna make this nicer. The goal being I'm gonna make this better. Well, it's a lot easier to be additive than reductive. And what we've done is add a bunch of stuff that is not data and information. Do the vertical lines do anything? Are the headings the most important thing on this table of data? Do I need to repeat? If I got region in the heading, do I need to repeat that in each of the rows? Do I need to repeat the dollar sign? It's going to be assumed that if I have the dollar sign once, that's the currency. That's the currency being displayed. So I can dramatically simplify this. The amount of stuff that I have removed that is not detracted at all from the information being presented is a little mind-boggling. Now, I know when I give one table example, you're like, yeah, I don't know, that looks kind of boring. Trust me, if you try it the next time you're doing a report or you're working on a dashboard or you're presenting the results of an analysis, start pulling stuff away. It does kind of magically make stuff clean and pure and more consumable, and it doesn't make it boring. I'll use another example. This is the default Excel column chart. And they're clearly data pixel ratios. We've got the border. By default, Excel puts a border around the chart. Like Excel is worried that charts are so powerful they might fly off the page, so we better contain them with a border. Kill the border. If it's a single series of data, why do I need a legend and a title? So there's lots of other. Do I need the vertical axis line? But there's another part here. We will sometimes plot data and say, oh, I can't fit the text in, but that's okay. I can angle it or put it vertically. Don't do that. We're now forcing the brain to rotate the text to horizontal in order to be read. That's forcing some little subconscious brain cycles that are not being spent consuming the actual information. That's bad. This same chart of data, make it a horizontal bar chart, apply the data pixel ratio, and again, most of what you're seeing here is the actual information, and it's much easier for us to read. Pie charts have all sorts of problems, but there we're getting beyond just the data pixel ratio, but we're making the brain do a lot of mapping, jumping back and forth. What is this color purple? Which one is that? The brain doesn't see areas, doesn't compare areas very well at all. It's another case where a simple horizontal bar chart would work. This is not by any means saying that a horizontal bar chart is the solution to everything. It is saying put some care into what you're presenting, understand how the brain works, learn some data visualization best practices, and start applying them. We're not talking about adding a whole lot of time. If we build up that muscle, if we learn how to do it, we will get to where we are very quick and very efficient at visualizing data effectively, and always knowing the pitfalls and knowing that this is the information I'm trying to represent, this is the best way to visualize it, and I will put the extra 30 seconds of care in to make sure that I'm really respecting my audience so it is really clear what is important and what's coming through. So now we've gone through and effectively communicated our results. So are we done? Well, not quite, because the fact is we talked about a process. If we have a process for intake and prioritization, that implies that we are doing this on an ongoing basis. So yes, we have to have prioritization and a way to complete the results and feed them back, but there's one more role for the analyst that sometimes we kind of just trust happens outside of our purview, and that's the analyst as a knowledge manager. What ultimately institutional learning are we contributing and moving along, to help the company move along, to move forward and be data informed beyond just the one question, the one answer to the one marketer for the one campaign. What broader learnings can we get? Well, if we go back to this concept of a hypothesis catalog and we kind of add a couple more columns and we say we had a question, what was the answer? Did we write the answer very succinctly? And you know what? Sometimes the answers are going to be inconclusive. That's okay. But let's put that rigor in our process to make sure we said, you know what? We did this analysis. We didn't really learn anything. Sometimes we actually get a deeper insight out of the analysis that we did. I will be the first person to say I have trouble saying the I word because believe me, I have lived it time and time again where somebody is coming to me saying, I need a weekly report or I need a monthly report. And the fact is, along with this report, I need to have the insights. You need to always give me a monthly report with the monthly insights. And we all know that, well, we as analysts know that doesn't necessarily happen. If you have a website where you have made no changes and you have asked no questions, to expect that the same data, the progress against your KPIs last month and how your KPIs have moved to this month, and you want insight when you didn't ask any questions, you didn't make any changes, uh, and it's not going to happen. So you're not always going to get insights. But you know what? If you have some rigor in your process where you've got all the questions that you're tackling and you're capturing when you do think you find a deeper learning and you write that down, well, then you're set up to have something you can communicate back out to the organization to use as a tool and say, we can share this across groups. We can take these deeper learnings and we can actually make the company smarter. So the big punchline, my conclusion is that truly effective analysis is a lot more than just fantastic analysis. And as analysts, we need to get much more comfortable stepping out of the role of analysts. Are we translating fuzzy business goals all the way into the right KPIs? Are we really helping own that? Are we doing some mapping to get from a business question to both to the appropriate KPIs as well as to testable hypotheses? Are we owning a process that makes sense for analytics to manage intake of a lot of questions and closing the loop ultimately back out to the organization, prioritizing them, making sure we're doing the right analysis? Yes, we have to be an analyst. But then once we've done the analysis, are we really owning and getting better at and honing, sharpening our saw when it comes to communication? And part of that means kind of learning some things about how the brain works and recognizing that it's important how the information is presented to get information into long-term memory. And then ultimately, are we owning, taking responsibility for actually organizational learning in a role of knowledge management? So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time.